Hey, welcome to Yuppies and Harpoons. This is Joe Moeller. I am the co-host, and with me is the other co-host, Jacob Lenzer. Jacob, how are you?
Hey. Doing well. How's your weekend?
Mine was pretty good. I ended up going to Vermont, Manchester, Vermont, for the the Green Mountain Bluegrass and Roots Festival. It was only about... It was basically Thursday through Sunday, but my girlfriend and I, we basically went up there for Saturday and Sunday. We had some family up there and basically camped out for a night and got to see a bunch of new artists. Someone I highly recommend is Rachel Baiman, Baiman, Rachel Baiman.
Okay.
Phenomenal. She only has like 46 monthly listeners on Spotify, and she plays better than hardly basically anyone I've listened to. So she's like my musical crush right now.
Okay.
So
I'll have to look her up.
You ever been to Vermont, man?
Check her out. I have. What a great state. I mean, there's so much to do there, and I feel like the culture is so unique. I would say if anyone coming from like Europe was coming to the States for the first time and wanted a good sense of what the U.S. is about, Vermont's one of the best states to visit, just to get a good sense and have American pride behind it.
My uncle said that Vermont, like, it defies categories. It refuses to be categorized. And I know that we're big on demographics, but Vermont's mostly going to be dead because it has a replacement rate of birth rate of 1.37, which is almost just above some of like the Asian countries that have like really pitiful birth rates. But they
don't make it easy to move to Vermont either. I mean, if you're born in Vermont, you might have a shot, but if you're not from there, good luck getting in.
But the cool thing about Vermont, and I guess from the political point of view, is like they actually take their, if you want to call it like localized socialism, seriously. And so, because every conservative critique of a liberal typically goes to, you can do whatever you want at the state or municipal level, but don't do any of that stuff at the federal level. And while they still vote for oftentimes very liberal people like Bernie Sanders or whatever for Senate, at the local level they're highly they believe in like redistributive economics, and that and they focus on that in the state. They believe in like preserving a lot of the wildlife out in Vermont, and they do a spectacular job at it. If you drive through, there's like very, very few stoplights, and there's no like Vermont has like a statewide ban on billboards, which I learned.
Yes.
And which is really, really cool.
Keeping it pretty for sure.
Yeah. So I love it. What are you drinking?
Today I got myself a Stiebel Radler, I believe it's called.
A Radler?
Kind of a grapefruit. It's a warm day here, so I wanted something a little bit more fruity, I guess, than a good stout or anything like that.
I have Jake's Abbey. It's a craft lager.
Okay. Appreciate the name recognition.
Yes, I'm trying to see if it actually says where it's from. I bought this in Dover, New Hampshire, but it's a family owned and operated, but I wanted to see where. Oh man, where is this thing from? It doesn't even say. That's where they get you. But anyway, this is a lager. I am definitely a lager man. I still think that we should have stuck to our roots with the Lager Lounge name, maybe. But oh man,
the next podcast, we already have the name for it.
I bet you Brendan turned the fridge down. Brendan's my roommate, and this is back in the coldest spot of the fridge. He froze the freaking beer, man. What is this nonsense?
Oh my goodness.
What is this?
At least you got something out of it.
Have you ever had like frozen foam?
I can't say I have.
That's so weird. It's carbonated. It's actually delicious. It's like It's like a beer float.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
At least
Okay,
it's nice and cold.
this is like a yeah. So to keep it on the beer, because now the beer clearly has like overtaken
We should
the
we should
course
just
of the
really
conversation.
just cut the episode here and leave the episode just with you trying to pour this thing, because it might take the full hour. It looks
That's the
like.
only thing. Yeah, the only thing. Joe attempts to pour beer. I don't even know
Yeah.
what you call that. That is like the scariest looking. That's literally like a float. So speaking of Vermont, ladies and gentlemen, in case you didn't know, New England, which is where I'm going to law school, is the capital of beer, and so it has Vermont has the highest concentration of like craft brewing per capita, and so
Hmm.
if you want to go to a place where people make their own stuff, it's Vermont is incredible. It's actually one of the things I love about Vermont is that you go to these little stores, and I mean I've been to the touristic spots and the regular rural Vermont places, and everything, no matter where you go, is made in Vermont. Like whether it comes to the
Yes.
socks, the mittens, the beer, the chocolate, the syrup. I mean the clothing. I mean it's just everything they make up there is it basically if you shut down the rest of the world, Vermont would be one of those states. I mean yes they import a lot of things. I'm sure because like what state isn't dependent on other areas of the world, but Vermont has a lot more self sufficiency or emphasis on self sufficiency than other states, and so I think that's one reason to appreciate it. This weird looking thing.
Did we get sponsored by like the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and I didn't know about that? Is this like a promo or?
I'm very good friends with the governor. Great guy. Mm.
That's great. So
I can't tell if
so
that's
yeah.
carbonated or if it's just really really cold. So the other drink that I had prior to this was the casino. So I probably just committed a mortal sin drinking those two. I'm sorry. What were you saying, Jacob?
Um, but yeah, do you want to jump on in here or find a good
What are we talking
segue?
about? Tell me. I got
What are we
plenty.
talking
So
about?
hit me up.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning. Trying to cover the petrodollar today. For those who aren't familiar with the petrodollar, basically it's the nickname for the U.S. global dominance on trade and using the U.S. dollar for every country trades within the U.S. dollar. So if the U.S. is buying goods from China, we use the dollar, not the yen. Or if Peru is buying goods from, let's say, India, again, you're using the U.S. dollar, particularly with oil, and so hence the name petrodollar. It's kind of an ingrained system at this point, that the world just uses the dollar as a world reserve currency, which has gone back to 1970s at this point. And why it's relevant is this is now kind of under question a little bit. So last week, Saudi Arabia and Iran had their first ever oil purchase between the two countries. Iran or India buying from Saudi Arabia oil using the rupee, the Indian currency. So it's kind of a shift in the last 50 years of kind of global trade, and kind of what does that do to the U.S. global dominance and the U.S. currency as a whole, is part of what's going on here. So
So what's your takeaway for why that matters? Like, so say other countries around the world just stop using the U.S. dollar. What would it create like hyperinflation in the U.S. because there's all of a sudden all these financial assets that are essentially they're no longer being purchased in U.S. dollars, and so now then the money supply of U.S. dollars does it just get concentrated in U.S. markets, or like what happens?
yeah, part of it is that is just kind of isolating the U.S. dollar. Another part of it, probably the bigger factor, is the U.S. having say in what happens around the world between countries that it doesn't really have authority over, it still had the petrodollar at the end of the day. Still was a reminder that the U.S. Is the global superpower and kind of dictates pricing as well. So a lot of countries have to use the U.S. dollar. Therefore, foreign exchange markets they have to go through. It's not a direct. When I go to Walmart or Whole Foods or wherever, I give them my $5. They take it. No harm done. What happens with here is you have, a country wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. They have to then go to a bank or to an institution, give them their currency in exchange for the U.S. dollar, and then go to that country and buy it. Then what happens, for example, Saudi Arabia with the sovereign wealth fund, they hold the U.S. dollar and it then traded for stocks or for other currencies, buying U.S. treasuries. Their sovereign wealth fund, and this happens all around the world. Norway is another great example. They have a massive fund, all in the U.S. dollar, not their local currency. So they're able to exchange on the New York Stock Exchange or other currencies or other markets such like that, which then allows for those markets to be propped up. So the New York Stock Exchange.
Oh, so other countries they'll basically throw their money into like the S&P 500
Correct.
or basically US dollar backed ETFs.
Correct. Right.
Okay.
And in the case of places like Saudi Arabia, where these funds are massive. I mean, we're talking about billions, sometimes trillions of dollars in these wealth funds, and that's going then back into the U.S. economy indirectly through investments. Whereas if they held their own currency, there would not be that liquid market to trade the funds and utilize those funds for these countries to then really benefit from the sale of oil. It would then go back into their own economy, where some of these countries do not have an economy really to support billion or trillion dollar funds, and therefore it's a lack of investment into those countries and an investment indirectly into the U.S. So that's part of the main reason for it, and I think it's worth noting some of the history behind how did the U.S. get here.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Didn't it, like during the 70s, basically the U.S., at least from what I understand, it was a net exporter for a number of decades following World War II, and it was basically to help the rest of the world rebuild. So that's why like Pittsburgh Steel and American auto manufacturing, for instance, was just a massive contributor to supplying the world with cars, supplying the world with metal.
Yes.
And up until like the 1970s, it was actually an exporter. But then, as those countries had basically, the U.S. then began running what I understand to be like large trade deficits to compensate for countries that basically build up their economies over time. Up until the 1970s, we're talking mainly Europe, and then those countries themselves became net exporters and needed a country like the U.S. to import its goods. Is that correct?
Right. And that kind of gets exacerbated then with the rise of a lot of emerging markets. For example, China, where prior to 1970s, prior to the Nixon coming in and opening up China to global trade, was really isolated from the world, and then comes in and now the U.S. imports from China, and so that, it was kind of that. It was a perfect storm in that sense of the U.S. looking to rebuild after World War II, just as you said. Famously the Marshall Plan, as we all know from history class, where after World War II came together and said, "Hey, here's a few $billion, Europe. Let's rebuild your countries to avoid some of the failures of World War One, where you have Germany in World War One get devastated by many of the negotiations after they lost." And I'll bring up John Keynes quite a bit, possibly today, although he is not my favorite economist, but he is kind of the world's leading economist over the last 100 years. he fought very hard against the negotiations after World War I because he understood by crippling Germany's economy, which many of more hawkish and conservative people after World War I wanted to cripple and wanted that reparation from Germany. Keynes saw that as a way of devastating Germany and then causing an issue. Now he didn't foresee World War II specifically, but you look at some of the reasons why the Nazi regime comes to power. It's because Germany's economy was devastated. They had massive payments to other countries, and they just
Yeah.
could not keep them up. And those
It
payments
seems
actually
like
continued
it,
for over almost 100 years.
that is such a careful like line you have to thread because people will easily jump on you and say, "Wait a second, are you like rationalizing the Nazi uprising?" And it's like, no, 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 no. These sorts of things occur all around the world all the time. Like you see radical Islam come up in pockets, whenever. Like I think we were talking about Sudan recently with like water supply and stuff. Like you see how that's related to like northern African countries. You can see uprisings and radical ideologies when the water supply is cut. And
Right.
so if you have financial, you know, ties that you're, obligated to pay, and it's completely basically it's indebted your whole country. It's going to foment radicalization in the population. I mean, no matter where you are,
Right.
whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Asia, it doesn't matter.
Or even here in the Rust Belt, right, where people, whether it's the
Yeah,
same, it's not apples for apples, but similar vibes of people feeling left behind or feeling oppressed by some of the decisions made, geopolitically, and now you have
yeah,
pockets of people in the U.S. feeling similar. Not in the same way of maybe Somalia, where you have a whole pirating industry now prospering, but yeah, similar to that. But
sure,
yeah, so
yeah,
kind of where I see the petrodollar and the U.S. dominance on the world reserve currency, it starts back after World War II. So you could pinpoint a few different times. I like to kind of kick off after World War II, which is the Bretton Woods Agreement. So this was in the late 1940s. A handful of the world countries came together, and the goal was to avoid World War II from happening again. That was, I mean, the clear goal. They wanted to learn from their mistakes after World War One, and John Keynes was one of the lead at that Bretton Woods Agreement. Bretton Woods is a resort up in New Hampshire. Actually, I don't know if you're aware of that.
yep.
So that's where
It's
the
right
name
near
comes
the
from.
Presidential
Just the name of the
Traverse.
resort.
I was there a couple weeks ago.
Yes.
We drove by it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we saw it. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful resort.
Yeah, they definitely picked a good spot to do this, and so it was a 3 week long conference, if I recall, um, and um, it would basically lead to what now is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and a lot of these different organizations around the world, similar to the IMF. They weren't called that after the Bretton Woods; those would come a little bit later, but the framework was developed there. With that, though, the U.S. kind of sneakily, you can go look back at some of the quotes. Keynes being the main, I would say, non-U.S. negotiator, and the rest was really dominated by the American individuals. Um, and kind of what happened is the U.S. took advantage of the situation in a way to favor them. And Keynes was famously very ill. He was towards the end of his life. I believe he dies actually very shortly after Bretton Woods or Bretton Woods. Um, and so as he was ailing, these many late nights, long days, and what comes out of it is something similar to the IMF, but then also agreeing that the world's reserve currency, so all money would be backed by the U.S. dollar, or the U.S. dollar would be the peg for currencies. And that would then lead to what we described earlier, where these countries then trade in the U.S. dollar and build their wealth funds around the U.S. dollar. Everything goes around the U.S. dollar. And the way the U.S. kind of goes about this is they say, listen, we understand that we are going to be in charge of the reserve currency, and there's a lot of risk for other countries to just trust that the U.S. is going to do what's best. But it's okay. We will keep it backed by gold. So every dollar you have is backed by gold in our treasuries, in our safes. So there's no risk involved, and that's kind of the sales pitch that they had, which worked. I mean, it got the agreement done, and countries bought it. We fast forward then to the 1970s. So almost 30 years later, 20 years later, and we have Nixon in office. Nixon being very focused on foreign policy. I mean, if you look at Nixon, has a track record, obviously known for Watergate, but foreign policy was very interventionist and really shapes a lot of the globalization that we see today comes under the Nixon
right, opening of China. Yeah.
Opening of China being probably the most notable. And just
I
pretty
mean,
much overnight.
the guy had Henry. Well, was this
Yes,
largely
yeah.
propagated by Nixon, or was it an initiative that was launched by Kissinger, or was it
Right,
both of
yeah.
them? Because
Kissinger
I
would
know that
be
Henry Kissinger was
right. Yeah, Kissinger definitely being probably the brains behind it. I might be giving Nixon a little too much credit there, but yeah. So you have all these people who really are focused on this, and before we know it, Nixon just has a press conference one night. He speaks to the world and says, "The U.S. is no longer going to be tied to the gold standard," and just like that, the U.S. became what's essentially called fiat currency or made up currency. I mean, it's backed by faith. It's because people believe that it's worth $20 or $50, but there's no backing to it
is your
to this day. Even
is your cat loyal to the gold standard?
she is very loyal to the gold standard, and actually she has something against
She came out
Kissinger
to express her
personally.
support. Yeah.
Yeah, she really doesn't like Kissinger. That's what set her off.
I have. I'm trying to work my way through Kissinger's book on diplomacy, but cool
Mhm.
random fact while we're talking about the gold standard is that New
Yeah,
Hampshire,
let's do it.
there was a caucus where the last member of the New Hampshire caucus, for supporting that all members in the New Hampshire Senate and the New Hampshire House be paid in silver. He died,
Wow.
and the funny
Right.
thing is everyone hears that and they're like, "Oh wow!" So we have like one of those lunatics who believes in like paying people in silver still. But the funnier part is that this guy, he was the last member of a broader coalition that were just adamant about this. Like all New Hampshire senators and and reps should be paid in silver. And then do you know how much New Hampshire reps are paid?
Probably a
It's
decent
$100.
amount.
It's $100 a
Really?
year, and it's
Wow.
a yep, and it's a they're in session half a year, 6 months a year, and they get paid
Wow.
$100.
I mean, that doesn't even cover. I just filled up my tank of gas for what more than that, almost $70 today. So I can't imagine.
Yeah, right,
Wow, I had
right.
no idea. That's good.
So
But
anyway,
well,
no, no,
yeah,
no, no.
and
But continue.
yeah, and personally, I think Kissinger doesn't get enough credit, and really the Nixon administration on foreign policy, and part of that's because of Watergate, rightly so. But just the resume of Kissinger during his time in office as Secretary of State is pretty remarkable, and the things he did. Not to mention how he really sets the stage for the U.S. as a global world power and kind of undisputed. He really kind of solidifies that. Now, 50 years later, not much has changed, and I think that's where you can start criticizing it. But at the time, it was pretty revolutionary, pretty amazing for the U.S. to be able to come up with something like that. Plenty of critiques in there, but the amount he was able to get done and how he was able to get done, I think, is worth noting, and so forth. So yeah, so that's what we kind of leave here. As you mentioned, there's always these people, including Trump, when he was running for office, he talked about going back to the gold standard. The idea being you can't really inflate your money or expand the money supply when you're tied to the gold standard, which up until the last really COVID-19 and many of the stimulus bills there, the U.S. wasn't doing. But that's, I think, under a little bit of question now about is the U.S. being responsible as the reserve standard of the world, and can countries trust that we're going to treat our money with respect so that other countries are not devastated by the decisions the U.S. make. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, that's definitely a little bit under question right now. And this all ties back the kickoff to this latest round of scrutiny really comes back to Russian invading Ukraine over a year ago now in early 2022. Um, so the reason for that is one of the major reasons it's under question is Russia was removed from SWIFT. And I don't know if you're familiar with SWIFT at all, or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
kind of have a good grasp on it. If you want to take a jab at explaining a little to people what SWIFT was, it was in the headlines all the time early in the Ukraine invasion.
Yeah.
But it's boring banking, so I feel like most people don't care about it, including myself to an extent as a
No,
banker.
keep going. Keep going.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mhm. But
go
yeah,
ahead.
Swift, the simple version of it is everyone knows what a routing number is, but Swift is a routing number for international banking. So here in the US, your routing number is tied to your bank, and that is tied to the Federal Reserve. So your routing number at your check, on the bottom of your check, says which Federal Reserve bank you're tied to. So my bank has a routing number that's specific to the Bank of Philadelphia because that's the Federal Reserve bank that takes care of my area. If Even though my bank is in multiple states, if I went to a different state, it would have a different routing number tied to that Federal Reserve. And there's, I believe it's 12 different banks across the country. I could be completely wrong about that. Federal Reserve banks. And then each bank has at least one routing number, if not multiple, per district. So it's quick and easy as Swift is the same way. It just identifies which bank you're paying in which country. And then it kind of breaks down from there as well. So by banning Russia from using the SWIFT system, which was also invented in the 1970s, it basically cut off Russia from receiving funds from international countries. And so that was a pretty major
Mm-hmm.
decision that was made in retaliation.
And the Swiss, I think that was a really big contributor, right? Because the Swiss broke their neutrality on that. Because a lot of those banks
Right.
are also located in Switzerland.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so you see a lot of that happen there with Russian. Yeah, the Swiss, for example, not being neutral finally. um, so that was a pretty big move. So what that caused was Russia still has exports, still is exporting their goods, particularly their oil and natural gas, um, just as one for their economy, but two also to help their war effort in Ukraine. I should help with question mark because I don't even like saying that, but so countries then are having it essentially forced countries then to look elsewhere as a means of trading with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the developed countries, I would say, we cannot trade with Russia. You have Germany being very out front about, we're cutting off natural gas supply even if our people freeze and don't have heat. We'll fight through this. But the flip side is you have many emerging countries, China, India, Pakistan, all these countries who saw a great opportunity for their countries, can bypass the morality and or any ethics involved in it because they can now get cheap oil.
Right.
Another
Yep.
factor to this is Russia was capped then on how much they could sell their oil for. There's essentially an equation developed that it has to sell for kind of pennies on what the oil is trading for around the world. So India, massive country, 1.3 billion people. They have
Right.
a lot
Largest
of
country. No,
energy
I
needs. They
think it's
need
at
fuels.
1.4, 1.3
Is
or
it 1.4
1.4.
now? Give it a
I
couple
think
weeks
so.
and
I
it might
think
be a 1.5. But but yeah, so I mean, so they have a lot of fuel needs, and they have a neighbor not far from them who has a lot of oil that's discounted and cheap. So they started importing it, despite what international pressures had. They basically said, "We need this oil. It's a good price. We're gonna do it. We'll look the other way for what Russia is doing with Ukraine. Not really our problem. We have our own problems. You guys, the world can figure out what's happening in Ukraine. We just want to make sure our country has fuel."
well,
So,
one.
mhm,
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, and so, yeah, this is where I think it's kind of fascinating is early on in the Ukraine invasion, countries around the world, rightly so, said, we're stopped trading with Russia. You see a slight dip in Russian exports. And I would love to be able to share the graph on the video as well. So you see this slight dip in the 3 months following the Russian or the Ukraine invasion. But then by really June of 2022, the Russian exports of crude oil comes back to where it was prior to the invasion, and peaks actually has an all-time high then in February of 2023. Obviously, fuel price or fuel usage goes up in the winter, and so now it's still it's fluctuating, but you really haven't seen a dip in Russian exports, um, which is really fascinating to me. Of we as the world tries to punish Russia, and a lot of it has not played out in a way that's actually punished Russia significantly, which
Mm-hmm.
just allows for their war efforts to continue, in a sense. Allows for funding for their war. So, yeah.
I think there's a lot of there's a lot of considerations to have here. I mean, militarily speaking, if we were to delve into Ukraine, I'm not obviously an expert on Ukraine, but I think one is how much is the U.S. interested in actually keeping Russia out of Ukraine? Is it really because they care about Ukraine as a nation? That's kind of a cynical question. Like, does the U.S. really care about the sovereignty of Ukraine, or is it more concerned with depleting the Russian military? And
Mm-hmm.
just basically feeding Ukraine whatever supplies will keep it resuscitated long enough so that the Russian military will be depleted, so it's no longer really an existential threat, um,
Mm-hmm.
especially to NATO allies. Um, but on the other hand, like when like the, if you look at specifically trade with India and Russia, the routes that have to be taken in order for Russia to be able to supply India with oil, they're all actually patrolled and protected by the U.S. Navy. Um, that's
Right.
one of the things that a lot of people don't realize when it comes to being a strong global currency is it on one hand that yes, does your currency have the capacity to handle borrowing, for instance, and can it handle massive fluctuations in global markets, where the domestic prices, so like if markets fluctuate crazy in terms of the, I don't know, if you're a U.S. citizen and prices and there's some disturbance overseas, is that going to drastically increase the price that it costs to buy milk for you? Or is that going to drastically increase the price for you to go out and get a mortgage?
Mm-hmm.
The answer to that is for a long period in U.S. I mean, for the last number of decades, it's been no. It doesn't really matter because the U.S. economy is so strong, it's so big that it can basically not only create dollars that are expendable for its own citizens, but it can be used as a monetary resource for other nations around the world. And even when things are kind of crazy and people are trying to buy into mass and use massive amounts of U.S. dollars, that consumption of U.S. dollars, by large industrial economies, doesn't hurt domestic purchasing power. That's a pretty complicated subject, but it's one of the requirements for what it means to be a global reserve currency. It's the idea that you have not only trillions of dollars, but tens of trillions of dollars that can handle, again, global fluctuations in any particular market. And obviously, I mean, our market prices, when it comes to consumer goods here in the U.S., they probably are affected by global tensions, global fluctuations in some particular way. But it's not substantial enough for it to cause like public resentment that would have like a political impact and warrant like a political response. And so that's one major point about like why the U.S. global currency has been so strong up to this point is that it's that there's no other economy that's been not only willing but capable to provide its currency to other nations, because other countries just don't have the stability. I mean, Europe, as an example, and this kind of goes down a rabbit hole, but Europe, even when you have like the euro, you have a country that it's now a net consumer of resources. It's not a net exporter of resources, and so I'm sorry. I think I think it's actually the opposite. It's I could be wrong about that, but I might need to go back and relook at that. But the euro itself does not have the capability of being on par with like the U.S. dollar, because it European nations are getting older and they don't have the wherewithal to be able to handle basically the trade surpluses of other countries, where they can buy other countries' resources at the level that the U.S. markets can handle. But I'm sorry, I'm saying all of this to get back to a broader point, which is that because the U.S. has such a strong global currency, and this is what's been sustained over the number of years, it has also an incentive to maintain that because it creates a dependency of other nations to if other countries have an opportunity to use a common currency, they're going to latch onto it because it creates an ease of transactions. And
yes,
the key to that is not just economic, but it's also military. It's also well, I'm not sure what the word would be, but it's also a military. There's also a military component to that, which is the U.S. doesn't just guarantee the economic stability, but it guarantees the fact that you can have safe international trade. And
yes,
so what I was saying was, like, when India, and ultimately what this comes down to is that when India and Russia are trading oil, and they decide to usurp the U.S. currency, I guess the irony of it is that the U.S. still guarantees the safe patrol of oil from Russia to India. And so when other countries are choosing to go around the U.S. dollar, the U.S. is ultimately going to have to decide how much does it want to be a global protector of free trade. This economic infrastructure, if you will, or this economic police infrastructure was put in place really to circumvent the Soviet Union. And it wanted to create a global trade network that kind of excluded the Soviet Union, whereas today, the U.S. is actually a fairly self-sufficient economy. Its number one trading partner is Mexico. In fact, it's the largest trading partner. It's the largest bilateral trade partnership between two nations in the world. Um,
Right.
and it's between the U.S. and Mexico, two bordering countries. And yeah, I think we could probably get into
Which
this at
I
some
think
point,
that's
but
very notable.
um,
Well, that's very notable to say because oftentimes you think of China, right? Everything's made in China, but really Mexico
yep, yep,
is that through the NAFTA deal and then the new NAFTA deal.
yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
what's interesting about China is that its workforce is on a per capita basis less educated than those in Mexico, and it's also
yep,
about 3 times more expensive now. And so the U.S.
yes,
is has very little incentive to trade with China. The the interesting thing when it comes to the U.S. is why, and I frankly don't have a good answer for this, but why over the years it's been unsuccessful in developing good relationships with its American partners like North and South America, in Latin America partners, because what you constantly see when it comes to the instability of the U.S. dollar, it involves countries like Brazil and Argentina, two countries that we are very, very close to, and that we could easily have positive trade relationships with. But
mm-hmm.
from what I've been able to find, and is that it's been honestly partly the fault of people like Henry Kissinger. Um, the U.S. has been very involved in basically overthrowing governments in Latin America, and it's created a
For sure.
very anti-U.S. Sentiment in Latin America, which I think is really coming back to, frankly, bite us in the ass when it comes to countries wanting to protect their own interests and resort to trading with other countries in a currency that isn't our own. Um, but but overall, I think that's a really. I'm sorry to get back to my original point. I think that you need a country that basically can facilitate the infrastructure or the economic infrastructure to have free trade, global free trade. Where I think the world is headed is actually in a very different direction, because if the U.S. dollar is not going to be the means of global trade anymore, if it's not going to be the global reserve, then it isn't really foreseeable that another currency is going to overtake. Like, I don't think anybody's expecting the yuan or the euro or any of these other currencies to overtake the U.S. dollar. I think what's much more likely is for there to be regional,
Mm-hmm.
power, that's exercised by certain countries over smaller countries in an effort to intimidate them to use their own regional resource. And the question is going to be ultimately for the U.S. is how much do they want to press, put pressure or put pressure to guarantee the safe patrol of these trade routes. And in addition to that, if the U.S. continues to offer free access through these trade routes, are countries that are wanting to exploit other smaller countries in their region to use their own regional currency, are they going to be able to offer those countries better benefit packages than the security that the U.S. can offer? What I think is a lot less likely to
Right.
happen is I don't think that the U.S. is all in the long run is going to be interested in guaranteeing trade routes for countries that honestly don't benefit them. To sound like an American, I have a strong American bias, but there was an interesting video I watched a while ago about how the U.S. adopted basically or took on the British Empire's cause. And this is a conversation between Christopher Hitchens and William F. Buckley. And they were kind of
And you
sitting
mean by
back,
like how the
nonchalant, talking about,
British were global, and then
yes, how
the
the
U.S. is
British
kind
were
of
a
taking
global
over as the global
superpower.
power.
Yes, and then as the Nazi Empire rose, the Third Reich rose and tried to, crush Europe and basically left the UK in shambles. the UK placed its emphasis on the importance of the U.S. of maintaining their cause, and that's why and again,
Yes.
it's not the only reason, but it is a contributing factor, because prior to World War II, and I mean also World War One, but even in between World War One, the U.S. has never been a country that's been interested in the scope of its history. It's never been in a country that's been that interested in global affairs, and I think there is a sentiment in the American spirit that is very skeptical of you like why is our navy the one that's patrolling these trade routes? Why are we using our resources to guarantee democracy around the world? We have democracy here, and we should be making sure that the countries
Mm-hmm.
that we're most dependent on share our values and interests, so that they're compatible with our system of government and our system of trade. But apart from that, let's just keep to ourselves. And that's always been an American instinct that I don't think has ever really been in the, I guess, in the old British model of government, of really wanting to expand the values of frankly of like a Judeo-Christian ethic, and wanted to create a vast empire. In the U.S., we've always been skeptical of that, and so that's kind of a tangent. But I feel like there's a sentiment in the American public that is naturally very, very skeptical of not only being a global currency, but of also being a military that secure these trade routes. And even if that benefits the U.S. from a policy level, I think from the public standpoint, it's something that many Americans are skeptical of. Do we need our aircraft carriers and naval patrol out there making sure that trade between India and Russia is safe? Like, why is that in American interest?
Yeah. Well, and like the U.S. almost falls backwards into being like the world superpower. So, kind of interesting fact that is in 1890 is when the U.S. became the largest economy. So, like pretty early on, just over 100 years after the founding of the U.S. is when the U.S. becomes the largest economy. But at the same time that this happens, you have people like Frederick Jackson Turner who coins, the frontier thesis of, go west, young man. The West is the next frontier, and go out west and make a name for yourself. We kind of eventually run out of the frontier in the U.S. because by the 1940s, you have most of the U.S. is filling in with population. You have just about all the states, all 50 states are have gained statehood at that point. We've kind of run out of the frontier in the U.S. And so you kind of see people take these 1800 mindset of the next frontier being the world global power, and they move it then to the world stage, right? And the whole kind of
Right.
post-colonialism. Now you have this dominance through economics and not through like a sovereign rule over countries, there. And then, through that time you have individuals like Kissinger who are very bullish about globalization and global dominance that only then exasperate the US being involved in everything. Which, I think it's no coincidence Vietnam is happening at the same time of Henry Kissinger, and those types of people, where the U.S. starts getting involved in these wars that don't have a clear focus, rather than just trying to keep the U.S. a dominant world superpower.
Right. Right. That makes, yeah.
But yeah, and I think another aspect to it is, as you were saying, there's not many other countries that really could be the reserve currency of the world. So if the U.S. isn't the only reserve currency, then you're going to have these regional currencies just kind of naturally prop up as countries try to grow themselves. So, you look at China, which would be the next default reserve currency as the second largest economy. They're growing, probably going to overtake the U.S. relatively soon. It's not really like a question. It's just because they have 1.4 billion people and a massive amount of resources. It's just a natural that they take over the world as the largest economy. But their currency is then not really viable because they manipulate it and they have such tight controls that
Yeah.
no one can trust it, because any day you could wake up and China decides we're going to do something to our currency that benefits us and harms others. Where with the US dollar,
It
no one's really doing that.
right, and isn't that the critique with what the U.S. did with SWIFT? Is that it was a sign that the U.S. is willing to, I guess, leverage its global currency dominance and really, frankly, try to screw someone over, screw a certain country over, as in Russia, by cutting off its ability to use certain financial markets that the U.S. has a global dominance in.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely sold as a way of hurting Russia and preventing Russia from having access to markets, liquidity markets. And I noticed it was like let's see how this plays out. Let's see if countries will move away than the U.S. dollar, or is the U.S. so dominant and so strong that even without SWIFT and Russia being involved in SWIFT, they're gonna look elsewhere then and not look at Russia. What's kind of
Mm-hmm.
played out is they found out other ways of still trading with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think
so
that that's a
yeah,
that's a really that's an interesting point, and it's like how much is the U.S. going to be interested in facilitating, securing these global trade routes, um, without, for countries that are choosing to go around its tariffs and its well, not just its tariffs, but it's yeah, I mean it's regulations in terms of who you can do trading with the U.S. dollar. And so if you have a country like India that's willing to say, hey,
right.
well, I'm willing to trade with Russia, using the ruble or using whatever, um, why is that? Why is the U.S. like? Is the U.S. going to be okay with protecting the trade route that Russia takes to ship its oil to India, and guaranteeing the safe travel, or a better, or maybe a policy suggestion that maybe someone at the State Department would have is, why don't you go and you fund some Somali pirates, have them go on a long expedition, uh, you know, and
Right.
and have them sink a couple oil tankers, and then see how much India is interested or how much. Well, yeah, and so I mean, I guess Russia might be liable for the oil until it arrives at India, so India doesn't really have a stake in learning a lesson. Um, but I mean, there are serious questions here. I mean, you saw with the Suez Canal crisis what
Mm-hmm.
things going wrong with global trade routes can do. And again, it kind of gets back to this point of, where is the future of economic trade going? Are we looking at a more hyper regionalized economy, a global economy, where Turkey is really controlling the Mediterranean, and France is really controlling a lot of the trade up in Europe, and the U.S. is controlling a lot of trade between Canada and and Japan's brought into like the I don't know, it's like the American Pact, like the American Family Plan or something. Like what is the future of global trade? You know, Obviously in China you have an interest in overtaking Taiwan, and I mean the interest there is pretty obvious. It's not actually to unite China; it's to take away the U.S. monopoly, or one of the primary U.S. suppliers of advanced Microsoft. I just blanked on the term, chips,
Microchips.
microchips.
Yeah.
Yeah, microchips.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, but China, it's interesting. Like, Japan believes that the U.S. is such a staunch. I guess, to reiterate my point about guaranteeing safe global trade routes, Japan and the Philippines and by the way, the Philippines are a country that the U.S. formerly occupied, and it was
Right.
formerly a colony in a way. Um, it has like the U.S. has like an 80 or 75% approval rating in the Philippines, and Taiwan. Obviously, the U.S. is very popular. You have all these Asiatic countries that are very interested in a strong U.S. involvement in global trade, or at least in trade as far as they're concerned, and that's a long, long way, across the Pacific. Um, and it's because the U.S. facilitates not just economic resources but military resources that safeguard these economic trade routes. And so, if China is the one that is patrolling beyond just the South China Sea, but into the mid-range Pacific, if you will, um, there becomes a real question on trade security. If Japan now is dependent on China to be the guarantee or the guarantor of its ability to trade with other countries, what does that completely changes the dynamic of how dependent Japan is on China, on how dependent it is on the currency in China, because China could certainly leverage its currency in exchange for its in exchange for its naval protections. And it's not even certain that that's something that the Japanese would agree to, because the Japanese have like the third strongest navy in the world. I think it's like the U.S., the British, and the Japanese, or the U.S., the Japanese, and the British. Um,
I think
but
there'd be a couple other. Well, wait, in terms of navy.
Well, yes, because
China,
go ahead.
China has. I mean, China right now has the largest. Well, sorry, the U.S. has the largest navy in terms of tons, shipping ton, but China has the most boats now and ships, just the pure number of ships, too.
You have to grade it by the capacity of those ships and how long they can,
Right.
how far they can sail. And so
where
there's no
China is using
China
diesel still, the U.S. has nuclear subs and nuclear fuel, so it's not
right.
China has a lot of boats, but not a lot of punch.
They can project strength into the South China Sea. They cannot project strength out to Guam, for instance, or to Australia, for instance. But they can project strength out into the intermediary Asian countries, and that's a concern. If you're someone like Japan, or if you're someone living in the Philippines. But this brings up a broader question, I think, that you're getting at with like the dominance of the U.S. dollar. It's that it's not just the economic. So even if you take away the benefits that the U.S. offers economically, like if China decided to stop manipulating its currency, and it didn't have a demographic crisis on its front doorstep, and people started using the yuan. How do you pronounce that again? I always get it. It's the yuan, right?
Yeah, yang yuan. Yeah.
Yeah. How is China going to guarantee that people trading in its currency, especially let's take oil for instance, that oil transport is going to be something that's dependable? Because if you're using Chinese currency to trade between, say, like India and, I don't know, Argentina, I'm not sure why they trade for oil, but
I like the example.
It's just the two random countries out of my ass. But
those are the first countries that came to mind too.
Yeah, so India and Argentina, I don't know, they're trading in something, right? And they're trading in Chinese in Chinese yuan. Like, why would they depend? Like, why would they want to use Chinese currency? Like, yes, there's economic benefits to it, but if you're gonna get disrupted by my favorite my favorite example here is Somali pirates, but if there's no guaranteed safety
I am the captain
of
now.
trade routes, yeah, like Tom Hanks did a whole movie, on this, on pirates overtaking global, massive carriers
Right.
of cargo, and what in like you need something that patrols that. And if you're dealing with a currency that's coming with a country that doesn't have the capacity to basically protect not only the currency but the transport that the currency is essentially funding, then why are countries going to have any confidence in that? And so there's a two-pronged component to trade is essentially what I'm saying.
Yep. Correct. Yeah, you nailed it there. I feel with you need the safety, and then you also need the ease of currency, where the Chinese currency currently doesn't have that.
And so essentially, what I think will happen is that the U.S. will recede from the international stage, probably from its protection of global trade routes, and with it, I think you're going to see well, frankly, the receding of the U.S. dollar in terms of its global prominence in some respect. It'll be slow, but there's nothing's going to replace it. If people who think that the BRICS currency or the euro or the yuan or whatever, nothing's going to replace it, because you need both of those things. And so
Correct.
We're looking at a future global economy that is hyper regionalized, and not something that, and so, or we're looking at a global economy that, if it's no longer dependent on the U.S. dollar, then it's not going to be dependent on any specific type of currency. It's going to be dependent on multiple regional currencies that are protected by regional military powers.
Yep. Exactly.
How's your yuppie shirt working for you?
Wait, did you say anything else? The last probably 12 seconds was gone.
I said that. How's your shirt? I like this shirt.
Thank you. It's a a fresh take on a nice summer day.
My frozen beer, ladies and gentlemen, it's gone. Hell of a day.
So
we'll have to continue this, man.
We will. We will. I mean, I think this is definitely not a topic going away anytime soon, and I think it's also really important to note the U.S. dollar is not really in jeopardy right now in terms of going away or in the dominance.
It's still like 84% of trade, right?
The world's
reserve financial
currency.
Transactions.
It is the currency that people spend. You can go to other country with the U.S. dollar, and they're going to take it. Where you don't see that with other currencies. The last like really challenger to the U.S. dollar was the euro, and with Brexit, I mean, that was a huge push against the euro as being the replacement to the U.S. dollar, because it kind of, although Britain has not adopted the euro, it still was a pretty devastating blow to the euro dominance. And then the second part of that is the euro doesn't have the military strength to be the world governor. So,
right.
So yeah.
Right.
So yeah, it's not a really conspiracy, but we'll keep this going.
No, this was fun. I enjoyed it. So, well, I think that's a great way to exit. This is only the third podcast that we've done, but we have lots and lots of more content coming towards you guys that we're going to be throwing out. We're going to be posting up reels and shorts and all that fancy schmancy material. Hopefully every day you'll be seeing hopefully some weekend personalized posts from Jacob and I. We're looking to potentially open up a Threads and a Twitter account, so please follow us there if you can. Our next podcast is up in the air. Like I said in my video, Jacob and I have a podcast that we're still trying to figure out what exact direction we're sending it at. It might be this is just going to be a good old boys podcast where, we're interested in our own mutual topics, but we'll talk about whatever. And so hang in with us if you see something that you like that catches your interest. Be sure to to listen and give us a like and subscribe. But as far as I'm concerned, I think this is a good way to end podcast 3. What do you say, Jacob?
Episode 003. That's a wrap.
003. All right.
003.
Peace. All right. Or I guess that means I love you. Well, that's kind of weird. That's weird. All right. This is Yuppies and Harpoons. And always. Yeah. This is Yuppies and Harpoons. And like I said on Pod 1, Jacob is responsible for the harpoon. We'll see you later. We'll see you next time. Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday.